It's finally time for you to rest, and for us to live." They thought the king was cold, the incense was thick, the mourners were weeping, and the silk of the casket felt like a shroud. But behind his still mask, Min Jun was counting their breaths. His body was a statue, his face marked by a single tragic tear, a masterpiece of deception. He felt his sister, Min Ji, lean in, her perfume smelling of lilies and triumph. "You always said family was everything," she whispered, her voice a razor blade wrapped in velvet. "I can't wait to see you burn." In that moment, the man who had survived every gang war in Seoul realized his greatest enemy wasn't the rival families, it was the woman holding the white flowers over his heart. Mr. Han had 3 rules for handling the funerals of the unlucky in Gangnam. 1. Don't look at the tattoos. 2. Don't ask why the suit has a bullet hole. And most importantly, never ever look the grieving family in the eye. But today, Mr. Han was breaking his own code. "Mr. Sejun," Han stammered, his eyes darting to the heavy-set guards at the door. The cooling system in the casket, it's reading a bit high. It's almost like—" "It's fine, Han," Sejun interrupted, his voice like sliding glass. He didn't look at the director. He was too busy sliding Min Jun's heavy gold signet ring off the dead man's finger and onto his own. He's gone. The only thing that matters now is who's left to lead. Minji Haran stood beside him, elegant in her dark floral dress, her fingers tracing the edge of the silk lining. To the blurred mourners in the back, she looked like a shattered sister, but up close, her eyes were bright with a terrifying relief. "The property deeds, the Swiss accounts, the shipping manifests," Minji murmured, her voice a low purr. "Everything he took from my father, it's finally coming home, isn't it?" "Every cent," Sejun replied, his hand resting on Minji's waist in a way that was definitely not brotherly. In the casket, Min Jun felt the cold air hit his bare finger where his ring used to be. He felt the betrayal settle in his chest like lead. He had come here to find a traitor. He had found a conspiracy. And as Minji leaned in one last time to fix his tie, her secret finally spilled out, the one that would change everything. The chemical cocktail coursing through Min Jun's veins was a masterpiece of pharmaceutical engineering, slowing his heart to a ghostly 30 beats per minute. In this state, the world felt distant, muffled by the heavy mahogany and the thick white silk lining of the casket. To the doctors who pronounced him dead at the scene of the staged cardiac arrest, he was a tragedy. To the thousands of soldiers in his syndicate, he was a fallen god. But to Min Jun, lying in the center of the funeral hall, this was the ultimate vantage point, the master's final trick, designed to smoke out the cancer eating at his empire. There was a strange, clinical peace in being a corpse. For the first time in 20 years, the phone in his pocket wasn't buzzing with threats, and the weight of the Seoul underworld wasn't resting on his shoulders. He lay there, perfectly still in his sharp black suit, his dark hair styled to perfection, looking every bit the dignified king, even in death. He had practiced the art of the stillness for weeks, training his lungs to take shallow, imperceptible sips of air so that not even the sharpest eye could see his chest move. He had to be perfect. If his pulse quickened, if his eyelid flickered, the mole would vanish back into the shadows, and Min Jun would truly become the ghost they thought he was. The plan had been simple, born from a cold necessity. For months, shipments had been seized, bank accounts frozen, and loyal captains assassinated with surgical precision. The leak was close, so close it felt like a blade pressed against his throat every time he sat at his own dinner table. He had faked this end to see who would reach for his crown before his body was even cold. He expected to hear the hushed whispers of greedy underbosses or the frantic scrambling of rivals. He expected to find the traitor among the vultures circling the periphery.
But as the heavy scent of funeral lilies filled his nostrils, a new, sharper chill settled over him, one that the drugs couldn't account for. He wasn't hearing the voices of his enemies yet. Instead, he felt a familiar presence approaching the side of the casket. He knew the rhythm of those footsteps. He knew the subtle scent of the perfume drifting toward him. It was the family he had killed for, the people he believed were his only sanctuary in a world of violence. Min Yoon remained a statue, his eyes closed, his face a calm mask that betrayed nothing of the growing storm inside his mind. He waited for the sound of a sob, for a hand to tremble against the wood of his coffin in grief. He waited for the emotional anchor that would prove his protector complex hadn't been a delusion. But as the footsteps stopped and the air grew still, the silence that followed wasn't one of mourning. It was the silence of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. He lay there, trapped in his own trap, realizing with a mounting horror that his final trick might have worked too well. He had invited the world to his funeral, and now he was about to find out exactly why they were so happy he was dead.
The clinical piece of the casket began to sour into a cold, biting realization. He had spent 30 years building an empire, convinced that his ruthlessness was a shield for those around him. He had called himself a protector, believing that his iron-fisted rule bought him a legacy that would outlive his pulse. But as the minutes ticked by in the sparsely populated room, the truth settled on him more heavily than the silk shroud. He hadn't built a community. He had built a vacuum. His protector complex was a mask for a deep emotional blindness. In his rise to the top, he had alienated every soul he touched, mistaking their terror for respect and their silence for loyalty. The pews weren't empty because of a lack of notice. They were empty because, to the world, the Iron King was finally gone, and no one felt the need to pretend they cared anymore. A single bitter thought flickered in the back of his mind, untouched by the drugs slowing his system. If he were to open his eyes right now, would anyone even be relieved? Or would they simply be disappointed that the monster was back? He had faked his death to see his world's reaction, but the reaction was a deafening nothing. He was a man who owned half of soul, yet in the end, he was a ghost haunting a room that didn't want him. Just as the weight of his loneliness began to threaten his meditative focus, the heavy double doors at the back of the hall groaned open. Two sets of footsteps entered, synchronized, confident, and far too rhythmic for a funeral. These weren't the hesitant steps of the few remaining friends. These were the steps of owners. Min Yoon felt his internal temperature drop as the scent of lilies and champagne drifted closer to the casket. The vultures had finally arrived, but they weren't the underbosses he had expected. They were the two people he had trusted with his very life. The rhythmic click of Italian leather on marble announced Seo-jun's arrival long before his shadow fell across the casket. Min Yoon, trapped in the pharmaceutical stasis of his faked death, felt the shift in the air, the arrival of the man he had hand-picked to be his successor, his protégé, and his lover. He waited for the touch of a trembling hand or the sound of a choked sob, the kind of grief that should follow the loss of a mentor. Instead, there was only the cold, metallic sound of a watch bezel being turned. Seo-jun stood over the corpse in a sharp, custom-tailored suit that looked far too celebratory for a wake. He didn't reach out to touch Min Yoon's hand. He didn't offer a final, silent goodbye. He simply stood there, irradiating an impatient energy, treating the funeral of the man who gave him everything like a tedious board meeting he was forced to attend.
10 minutes behind schedule, Seo-jun murmured, his voice devoid of the warmth Min Yoon had once found so comforting. Min Yoon's internal focus wavered as he felt Seo-jun lean in closer, not to whisper a prayer, but to inspect the physical remnants of the empire. He felt Se-jun's gaze lingering on his fingers, specifically the heavy gold signet ring that symbolized the absolute power of the syndicate. In the dark, silent world of the casket, Min-jun felt the first tug of a true, visceral violation as Se-jun's fingers brushed against his own. It wasn't a lover's touch, it was the cold, efficient grasp of a thief. Slowly, Se-jun worked the ring off Min-jun's stiff, drug-chilled finger. As the weight of the gold left his hand, Min-jun felt a part of his identity stripped away while he lay there, powerless and broken to the outside world. He heard the soft clink of the ring as Se-jun slid it onto his own hand, testing the fit, asserting a leadership that had been stolen rather than earned. Se-jun exhaled a long, satisfied breath, the sound of a man who had finally stepped out of a long shadow. He checked his watch one more time, the ticking second hand sounding like a countdown in Min-jun's ears. The show was almost over, and for Se-jun, the real work of dismantling Min-jun's legacy was just beginning. Min-jun lay in the silk-lined dark, the master's final trick turning into a front-row seat to his own erasure. The protégé he had loved was no longer waiting for the king to rise. He was simply waiting for the lid to close. The heavy double doors of the hall groaned as the few invited mourners took their seats, the sound echoing like a gavel in the silence. Se-jun stepped toward the mahogany podium, his posture perfect, the stolen signet ring glinting under the chandelier light as he gripped the wood. From his vantage point in the silk-lined dark, Min-jun listened as his protégé began the performance of a lifetime. Se-jun's voice broke with practiced precision, a masterful display of subverted power dynamics that had the distant mourners lowering their heads in respect. He spoke of Min-jun's unwavering honor, describing him as a visionary leader who had sacrificed his youth to bring order to the chaos of Seoul's underworld. To the public, it was a moving tribute to a fallen king. To Min-jun, every word felt like a clinical stroke of a scalpel, peeling away his legacy to make room for the new regime. "He was more than a boss to me," Se-jun's voice boomed through the hall, rich with a grief that sounded hauntingly real. "He was the architect of our future, a man whose shadow we were all proud to live in." The hall filled with the soft collective sigh of the audience, but then the footsteps returned to the side of the casket. The moving public speech was over. The private execution was beginning. Min-jun felt the air grow cold as Se-jun leaned down, his face hovering just inches above the corpse, his body shielding him from the view of the pews.
The scent of Se-jun's expensive cologne, the one Min-jun had gifted him, filled the casket. The warmth of his breath was a sickening contrast to the drug-induced chill of Min-jun's skin. "I've spent 10 years practicing that look of devotion," Se-jun whispered, his voice dropping to a low, lethal purr that never reached the back of the room. "Every morning, I woke up and wondered if today would be the day I'd finally get to stop pretending." He reached out, his fingers brushing the lapel of Min-jun's suit with a mock tenderness that felt like a threat. "Finally," Se-jun murmured, his words dripping with a decade of suppressed loathing. "I don't have to look at your face anymore." The internal monologue in Min-jun's mind roared, a silent scream of fury that the slowing drug struggled to contain. He had expected betrayal, but the sheer clinical coldness of Se-jun's hatred was the stunner he hadn't prepared for. Se-jun stood back up, smoothing his suit jacket with a satisfied flick of his wrists, leaving Min-jun in the dark to contemplate the depth of his own emotional blindness. The man he had loved hadn't just stolen his ring, he was celebrating the erasure of his existence. The heavy, rhythmic tread of combat boots signaled the approach of the one man Min-jun believed was incorruptible. In the hierarchy of the syndicate, Sang-woo wasn't just a bodyguard, he was the Iron Shield, a man who had taken 3 bullets from Min-jun over a decade of service. To the mourners in the back, Sang-woo looked like a grieving sentinel, his face a mask of stoic discipline as he stood at the foot of the casket. But to Min-jun, whose senses were heightened by the stillness of his faked death, the soldier's breathing was too steady, his posture too rigid with a new allegiance. Seo-jun didn't turn around to greet the newcomer. He simply waited, his fingers tracing the stolen signet ring on his own hand. The air between the two men didn't crackle with the tension of a standoff. It hummed with the smooth efficiency of a transaction already finalized in the shadows. "Is it done?" Seo-jun asked, his voice a low, commanding thread that barely drifted over the silk lining of the coffin. "The perimeter is secure. The loyalists have been reassigned," Sang-woo replied, his gravelly rasp. Min-jun felt a cold spike of adrenaline fight against the sedatives in his blood. To hear his most trusted soldier speak of reassigning the men who had been their brothers in arms was a betrayal that cut deeper than Seo-jun's petty insults. This was the dismantling of his entire defense, the systematic erasure of his safety net, while he lay powerless and broken before them. Then came the sound that truly signaled the end of Min-jun's reign, the heavy metallic jingle of a specialized keyring. These weren't keys to a car or a penthouse. They were the encrypted hardware keys to the syndicate's primary vault, the nerve center of Min-jun's multi-billion won empire. Sang-woo reached out, his hand passing directly over Min-jun's corpse with a clinical indifference that felt like a slap. He pressed the keys into Seo-jun's open palm. "He's a ghost now, Seo-jun," the bodyguard murmured. His eyes never once dropped to the man he had sworn to protect with his life. "The vault belongs to the living." Seo-jun closed his fist around the keys, the metal clicking against the signet ring in a symphony of theft. "Good. Prepare the transport. We leave as soon as the sister says her goodbyes."
Min-jun lay in the dark, his internal monologue a roar of silent fury as he realized the depth of his emotional blindness. He had bought Sang-woo's loyalty with money and status, never realizing that the man was simply waiting for a higher bidder. The protector was now entirely unprotected, a ghost trapped in a mahogany box while his kingdom was handed over like pocket change. He had come to this funeral to find a mole, but he was finding a world that had moved on before he was even buried. The heavy double doors of the funeral hall creaked open one final time, and the thin, scattered whispers of the remaining mourners died instantly into a vacuum of silence. The air itself seemed to grow heavy as Min-ji Harin stepped into the room, her presence commanding a gravity that even the Iron King would have envied. Min-jun, suspended in his drug-induced purgatory, felt the shift in the room's temperature, a cold, sharp elegance that could only belong to one person. She didn't wear the traditional heavy black of a grieving sister. Instead, she moved through the pews in a dark floral dress that clung to her like a second skin, looking less like a mourner and more like an angel of death. In her hands, she carried a small bouquet of white lilies, their scent aggressive and cloying as she approached the casket. To the blurred figures standing in the background, she was the picture of tragic grace, the shattered sibling left to pick up the pieces of a broken dynasty. Min-ji's footsteps were light, almost ethereal, as she reached the side of the mahogany box. She didn't look at Seo-jun, who stood back to give her space, nor did she acknowledge the defected bodyguard still clutching the keys to the vault. Her entire focus was on the corpse of the man she called brother. Min-jun felt her shadow fall over him, a dark shroud that blocked out the dim light of the chandeliers.
He waited for the familiar warmth of her hand, for the sound of the girl he had raised and protected from the filth of the underworld. He had faked this death for her, too, to ensure that the empire he left behind would be a fortress she could live in safely. He had been her protector, her shield against the ghosts of their past. But as Minji leaned in, her face hovering just inches from his, there was no sound of a sob, no tremble in her breathing. Instead, he heard the faint, rhythmic rustle of the silk as she brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead with a tenderness that felt chillingly theatrical. Her expression, visible only to the dead man and the silent, watching Sao Jun, was a complex tapestry of triumph and a relief so deep it bordered on the unsettling. The silence of the room was absolute, a heavy weight that pressed down on Min Jun's chest as he realized that the angel standing over him wasn't there to say goodbye. She was there to witness the end of an era she had helped to dismantle. The master's final trick had brought the most dangerous player to the table, and as Minji placed the white lilies over his heart, Min Jun realized with a mounting, drug-stifled terror that the sister he thought he knew was the greatest mystery of all. The stillness in the funeral hall became something heavy and suffocating as Minji Harin remained leaned over the casket. Min Jun, trapped in his drug-induced paralysis, felt the heat of another presence closing in, the familiar clinical scent of Se-jun's cologne mingling with the cloying sweetness of Minji's lilies. They were both there now, hovering over his corpse like twin shadows. He waited for the friction of grief, for the tension that should exist between a grieving sister and a mourning protégé. Instead, he felt a terrifyingly smooth alignment in their movements. Minji turned her head slightly, her gaze lifting from Min Jun's frozen face to meet Se-jun's eyes across the mahogany divide. In that moment, the silence spoke louder than any confession. There was no shared sorrow in that look, no seeking of comfort in the wake of a tragedy. It was a gaze of unsettling warmth and triumph, a wordless exchange between two architects who had finally finished their masterpiece. Min Jun, whose emotional blindness had always been his greatest flaw, finally saw the truth through the cracks in his own plan. They weren't just two people mourning him, they were a team. Se-jun's hand, now weighted by Min Jun's stolen signet ring, reached out and settled on the small of Minji's back. The gesture was intimate, possessive, and entirely devoid of brotherly comfort. It was the touch of a partner in a shared crime. Min Jun felt the leaden weight of betrayal settle in his chest, far heavier than the chemical slowing his heart. He had spent years believing he was the sun they both orbited, the protector who kept their worlds turning. He had never imagined they were orbiting each other in the dark, waiting for him to burn out. The realization shattered his clinical peace. Every memory of their loyalty was recast in a new, sickening light. The master's final trick had been intended to flush out a single mole, but it had revealed a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of his home. He lay there, a ghost in a silk-lined box, watching as the two people he loved most celebrated his erasure with a single victorious glance. They weren't just ready for him to be gone, they had been orchestrating his departure for years.
As Minji's lips curled into a soft smile that blended tenderness with a chilling sense of relief, Min Jun understood that the funeral wasn't for him, it was their coronation. He was no longer the king, he was the footstool they were using to climb onto his throne. The air in the funeral hall grew suffocatingly still as Minji Harin leaned over the open casket one final time. To the mourners blurred in the background, she looked like a sister sharing a final sacred confidence with her brother.
But as she drew close enough for her breath to warm the drug-chilled skin of Min Jun's ear, the unsettling warmth in her expression sharpened into a lethal clarity. "You always did have a savior complex, Min Jun," she whispered, her voice a low, melodic blade that never reached beyond the silk-lined walls of his mahogany prison. "You looked at a crying 6-year-old girl in the wreckage of a burning estate and thought you were being a god by saving her. You gave me a new name, a new life, and called me sister, as if that could wash away the blood of my real family on your hands." Min Jun's internal world, already reeling from the betrayal of his protégé, fractured entirely. The secret he had never suspected began to unfurl with agonizing precision. He was the protector who had raised his own executioner. "I am not your blood, and I was never your sister," Minji continued, her fingers tracing the edge of his suit lapel with a terrifying tenderness. "I am the daughter of the man you slaughtered 20 years ago to take this city. I have spent every waking second of the last 2 decades playing a role, waiting for the moment I could look down at your corpse and tell you that I was the one who fed the police your locations. I was the one who poisoned your lieutenant's minds, and I was the one who gave Se-jun a reason to hate you as much as I do." The revelation was the stunner that the master's final trick had inadvertently invited. Min Jun lay paralyzed, not just by the chemicals in his veins, but by the weight of a 20-year lie. The girl he had cherished was a ghost of his own making, a survivor who had turned his protector complex into his greatest vulnerability. "Thank you for the empire, brother," Minji whispered, her lips curling into a smile that blended triumph with a chilling sense of relief. "We're going to burn the rest of it down tonight." She pulled back slowly, her elegant floral dress swaying as she stood tall beside Se-jun. Min Jun remained a statue in the dark, but the clinical peace was gone, replaced by a cold, incandescent rage that the drugs could no longer suppress. He had faked his death to find a mole, but he had discovered that his entire life was a lie built on the ruins of the family he had destroyed. The revelation of Minji's true identity didn't just break Min Jun's heart, it shattered the very foundation of his reality. The pharmaceutical wall he had built around his nervous system, the slow-motion peace that kept his pulse at a ghostly crawl, began to crumble under the sheer incandescent heat of his grief. He was the Iron King who had been outplayed by a child, a protector whose greatest act of mercy had been his own death sentence.
As Minji stood back, her hand resting triumphantly on Se-jun's arm, the silence of the funeral hall felt like it was pressing inward on the casket. For 20 years, Min Jun had believed that blood and love could wash away the sins of his rise to power. He had lived for the girl in the dark floral dress, never realizing that every sisterly hug was an act of surveillance, and every "I love you" was a nail in his coffin. The internal monologue that had been his only company in the dark turned into a roar of silent agony. The chemicals in his blood fought to keep his muscles limp, but they couldn't stop the primal response of a soul in terminal pain. Deep within his still, broken body, a physical reaction ignited, a betrayal of the flesh that his training couldn't suppress. Minji was still smiling, that unsettling, complex expression of triumph still lighting her face as she looked down at the corpse one last time. But then the smile flickered. Her eyes narrowed, focusing on a tiny, glistening movement on Min Jun's pale cheek. From the corner of his tightly closed eye, a single, physical tear escaped. It wasn't the tear of a dead man, nor the reflexive leak of a sedated body. It was a slow, heavy drop of pure, living sorrow that tracked a wet path through his makeup and down toward his ear.
The moisture caught the light of the chandeliers above, shining like a diamond against his stone-cold skin. Minji's breath hitched in her throat, the sound sharp and jagged in the quiet room. The relief and triumph in her expression vanished, replaced instantly by a primal, soul-deep horror. She took a staggered step back, her fingers clenching the white lily so hard the stems snapped. "Sejun," she whispered, her voice no longer a lethal purr, but a trembling gasp of terror. He heard. He's listening." Sejun's face went ash-white as he followed her gaze to the single wet trail on the face of the man they had just buried with lies. The master's final trick had reached its breaking point. The stunner was no longer Minji's secret. It was the fact that the ghost was no longer a ghost. The power dynamic flipped in a heartbeat, the room shifting from a place of victory to a trap with no exit. Min-jun lay there, his eyes still closed, but the tear had signaled the end of the masquerade. The drugs were losing their hold, and the rage was taking over. The horror in Minji's eyes was the last thing she truly owned before the world inverted. The single tear was still wet on Min-jun's cheek when the chemical shackles finally snapped under the weight of his incandescent rage. In one fluid, violent motion, the corpse ceased to be a statue. Min-jun's eyes snapped open, not with the glazed fog of a man waking from a coma, but with the sharp, predatory focus of a king who had just returned from the gates of hell. Before Minji could scream, before Seo-jun could even register the movement, Min-jun's hand shot out of the silk-lined casket. His fingers, cold as ice, but possessed by a terrifying, renewed strength, clamped around Minji's wrist like a steel trap. The white lilies she held shattered, petals fluttering onto his chest like falling snow, as he jerked her forward until her face was inches from his own. The funeral hall, once a tomb of hushed betrayals, erupted into a chaotic vacuum of sound. The mourners in the back pews gasped and retreated, their faces contorted in a mix of religious terror and raw panic as they realized the man they came to bury had been a silent witness to every ugly word. "You should have made sure I was cold, Minji," Min-jun said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like it had been dragged through gravel and smoke. It wasn't the voice of a brother. It was the voice of the monster she had spent 20 years trying to slay. Seo-jun scrambled backward, his hand instinctively reaching for the pocket where he had tucked the stolen signet ring, but his knees hit the mahogany pew behind him. He looked down at the dead man and saw not a victim, but a judge. The subverted power dynamics that had fueled their triumph evaporated instantly, leaving them naked and defenseless in a room full of people who now saw them for exactly what they were. The Empire, the secret, the daughter of a dead man, Min-jun murmured, his grip tightening until Minji's face contorted in pain. I heard every word. I felt every touch. I watched you slide my life off my finger and onto yours. His gaze shifted to Seo-jun, a look so cold it seemed to freeze the very air in the hall. The vault keys you're holding, they won't open a single door in this city. I changed the codes before I died. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The master's final trick hadn't just been a test of loyalty, it had been a preemptive strike. Min-jun pulled himself up into a sitting position within the casket, the black suit wrinkling as he rose like a ghost, reclaiming his throne. He looked out at the sparse, terrified crowd, the defected guards, the greedy associates, and the two people he had loved most. The funeral hall had become a courtroom, and Min-jun was the only one with the power to pass sentence. He released Minji's wrist, but the mark of his hand remained, a red brand of his return. He stood up, stepping out of the mahogany box and onto the marble floor, his presence filling the void of the room until it felt like the walls themselves were bowing to him. "The funeral is over," Minjun declared, his voice regaining its lethal, commanding edge as he looked at the traitors who had thought him gone. "But the reckoning is only just beginning."